I know that I'm somebody who I don't speak unless I'm spoken to or unless I have something to say. So greeting people, like saying good morning when I walk into an office, or saying good morning ever when I, walk into a room or talk to it doesn't even occur to me to do that. Like, I've trained myself to do it, but it's not natural for me. It's not natural for me to greet people just because I happen to be in the same room with them. If I'm introduced to somebody, that would be a thought, like, okay, yeah, I should, because it's an introduction. But I've always forgotten to do those things. But that can be misinterpreted. That one thing can be misinterpreted in so many different ways.
Welcome back to Mother's Guide Through Autism. I'm Bridget Shipman, and I'm your host. Today, I'm speaking with Jaime A. Heidel. Jaime is the Articulate Autistic, and she was diagnosed later in life with autism and ADHD. She's a writer, an advocate, a consultant, and a communication translator. She hosts regular discussions on her Instagram page and writes articles for her website, Vocal Media, and Special Listener. In 2023, she published her first nonfiction book from the autistic perspective entitled, What Did I Do Wrong? An accessible guide to preventing traumatic misunderstandings between you and your autistic loved one, which is available on Amazon for Kindle and also paperback. Enjoy this episode. Today, I am speaking to a lovely soul, Jaime. You guys heard her introduction, you heard her bio before you joined this interview. So you know a little bit about Jaime, but she's going to share her story and some of the things that she's doing with her world, her life. She's got a book. We're going to talk about all of that. So welcome to Mother's Guide, Jaime.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
You bet. Well, I want to I always start out with the same question just so that our audience and listeners can get to know you. Tell us what you do and how you came to do it.
Well, I am a writer and an advocate and a autistic communication translator. It started about 4 years ago. I was writing about natural health. That was something I was writing about probably for about almost 10 years. And on the side, I started realizing that I started realizing that I was autistic, and I started writing about it kind of on the side. And then I started a video series on my YouTube channel, which right now I'm not using, but I do plan to eventually get back to that. And I started a series called Why Autistic People Do That. And I did about like 35, 36 videos talking about certain traits and what's happening, like what the trait is and what's going on for the autistic person. And I did a video series on that, but then I found it just too much to keep up with. So I started writing on social media, and I started interacting with other autistic people, neurotypical parents and partners and friends who wanted to understand the autistic people in their lives. I started posing discussion questions, and it kind of blossomed from there. And then I started my own website, thearticulateautistic.com. And I started writing about my own experiences, and also taking the experiences that other people have had, especially autistic people, and bringing that to the forefront as well. Because, they say if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. So my experiences might not necessarily be the other person's experiences. So I wanted to bring as many viewpoints as possible and sort of curate them and send them out into the world. And eventually, over time, that became a book.
Yeah, I love that because that is the one thing that I can't do, right? People always say, my role in this is strictly as a mother.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what it's like to live with autism other than that one snapshot, right?
Right.
So Joseph is the one that is living with it. And it's so interesting to me. I love that more people are curious and really want to go directly to you because I've tried to get people to go directly to Joseph, and I don't know, some do, some don't. So I think there is now an audience that really, truly wants to hear from you and other people on the spectrum. A question that I get a lot is, okay, I don't know how old you were when you were diagnosed. Some folks get diagnosed later. Can you tell me what it was like to get a late diagnosis? Tell me about that a little bit and how that came to be.
Okay. It was a very painful process. I wasn't officially diagnosed until I was 35. I'm 44 now. So it was a very late diagnosis. So I grew up in the 80s and 90s when there was a very clear line of demarcation between someone who was considered disabled and someone who was considered abled.
Mhm.
So there wasn't a lot of, nobody would have looked, I don't think, at my traits or my behavior or the way I spoke or anything and looked at it and said, oh, she's probably autistic. I think if I were a child now, they would have caught it instantly. Um, I don't think I would have had to wait any length of time. I think by the time I hit like first grade, maybe even sooner than that, they would have known. But this was the 80s and 90s, so this was not a time where many people were aware of it. I'm sure people were, but not in my circle of life, not in my friends, my family, teachers. Nobody had any idea what was going on, and because of that, because I had these traits and these behaviors, and I seemed, like quote unquote, seemed like everybody else. And I did struggle in school, but not that much. People didn't know what to make of me. So I was bullied, I was ostracized, I was picked on, I had abuse and trauma at home. Nobody knew how to deal with me. But it really comes down to that. And a lot of people in my family and my immediate circle just thought that the prevailing theory was everything I did was for attention, and people treated me accordingly. They were like, she's doing it for attention, so don't give her attention. I have a lot of feelings about the whole attention thing to begin with, but that could be a whole other podcast. But it took me until like I had panic attacks. I started having anxiety attacks when I hit my teen years. I was put on medication. I went to therapists and psychiatrists, and everybody was trying to figure out, what is quote unquote wrong with this person. And it took me a very long time. I mean, I had a breakdown in 2014. I went into full autistic burnout. I just couldn't cope anymore. I had left a very abusive relationship, and it's a long story. I won't get into the whole thing, but suffice to say, I ended up having a breakdown, and I was in the hospital for a while. And when I got out, I found a wonderful therapist who helped me. I knew probably by the time I was 27, 28, that I was autistic because I happened to run across it online. But I didn't get an official diagnosis until after the breakdown. I found this amazing therapist, and I said, these are my traits. This is how I think. This is how I feel. And I was able to get a diagnosis that way. So it was a very long and arduous process.
Yeah, that's I know the time frame you're talking about because my son was at the beginning was, pretty much just script vocab. I mean, he didn't really speak other than that. Like he had vocabulary, obviously. So it was easier to diagnose my son. And at
Hmm.
that time, I know exactly what you're talking about because everyone referred to that movie Rain Man with Dustin Hoffman
Yeah.
to reference autism, right? And it was
Yeah.
just like it was a very different time.
Yeah.
And so I do believe that there are more late diagnoses going on as we learn more about it. And I hate it that that was how it was for you. So and I appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing that because I know that there's so many struggles growing up because the diagnosis, I know my son had them too. What were some of the big ones for you? The struggle growing up not knowing?
Well, I'd been thinking about this, the term struggle, because I know you did send me some questions. So I had an idea of what you were going to ask me, which I very much appreciate. My autistic brain appreciates that very much. And
You're
the
very
only The only thing I can think of is struggle doesn't begin to describe it. It's too gentle a word. I know that there were what it was like growing up is just basically feeling like an alien, but not necessarily realizing that there was something. I think I'm trying to think of the best way to describe this. It was kind of like I didn't really know I was different until I was in front of other people, and they would have these reactions to me, and I couldn't connect their reactions to me to my behavior or my traits or my facial expression or whatever it was that I was doing. I didn't make the connection. So the struggle was I'm me and I'm expressing myself exactly the way everything inside of me is telling me to express myself. And yet somehow it's wrong and it's offending people and it's making people not want to be around me. And I couldn't make any sense of that. I couldn't connect my behavior to their response. And for me, I would just be walking along or talking or having what I thought was a normal conversation with someone. And all of a sudden they'd be like, how dare you? I can't believe you said that, or I can't believe you did that. Or, it might not even be something I said or did. It could just be like my face. I could just be sitting there having a neutral facial expression and, that flat affect. And people are like, what's your problem? Why are you acting like this? And I'm like, I'm literally just sitting here. So it was very traumatic. I have complex PTSD because of it.
Yeah. Well, I was really, really absorbing what you were saying to me. And I'm such an empath anyway, and I could feel myself going into, oh my gosh, what must that feel like to not
Yeah.
understand what you're just being you, and why is that
Yeah.
wrong? Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. Struggle probably is a soft way to describe that, more like trauma.
Yeah.
Yeah, I understand now that you explained it, so I appreciate it. I know for being the mom, right, as Joseph has named me the mother guide, I I know that communication for us, for Joseph, my son and I, although I didn't even understand how much we struggled with communication. I just knew language was delayed. He's 31 years old now.
Okay.
And we still like we still go like he'll explain something to me and I'll say, Joseph, could you try again? I have no idea what you're talking about. Or
Okay.
he'll look at me. I'll get the confused look and I'm like, oh, he has like, Joseph, do you have any idea what I'm talking about? Let me try again. Like, so
Yeah.
and usually we're saying the same thing,
You're just
which,
saying it differently.
yeah, completely differently. And then we go, oh, we're doing that again. So I would love to get more insight on the common communication misunderstandings that we all experience. The neurotypical individuals growing up. I mean, I know that as a neurotypical person, I have not understood it. So
Right.
help me understand.
I can try my best. So the best way I can explain it is that basically everything about me when I was a child was misunderstood. So I mean that goes from my flat affect, my monotone voice, my inability to read social cues, my slow processing speed, my inability to, under or not understanding things and having to ask lots and lots of questions. There are, I think in the book I counted 60 common misunderstandings. So for me to list them off would be impossible. Otherwise, that's all I'd be doing throughout the entire podcast. I'm sure there are even more. It's when your brain is fundamentally different from just about everybody else around you. The misunderstandings can happen over anything. I mean, I can give you some examples. I know that I'm somebody who I don't speak unless I'm spoken to or unless I have something to say. So greeting people, like saying good morning when I walk into an office or saying good morning ever when I, walk into a room or talk to it doesn't even occur to me to do that. Like I've trained myself to do it, but it's not natural for me. It's not natural for me to greet people just because I happen to be in the same room with them. If I'm introduced to somebody, that would be a thought like, okay, yeah, because it's an introduction. But I've always forgotten to do those things, but that can be misinterpreted. That one thing can be misinterpreted in so many different ways. Well, you know, they're rude, they're standoffish, they don't like people, that one's true, but they don't like to be around, you know, they don't like to be around us because they have a particular dislike of us that they don't want to tell us. And that's not it. That's not the case. It's just my reasoning for not wanting to be around people a lot is because people misunderstand me, and then they have a reaction to me, and then it scares me, and it brings up all my trauma all over again.
While we're on this topic, I want to get more into your book.
Okay.
What Did I Do Wrong? An accessible guide to preventing traumatic misunderstandings between you and an autistic loved one. So tell us about that, because I know our listeners are going to want to grab a copy.
What did I do wrong? The reason I titled it that is because my whole life, that's the question I was always asking. Because I wasn't able to connect my behavior, I'm sorry, the responses of others to my behavior, again, my traits, whatever it was I was doing or not doing, I wasn't able to connect that. So I would always ask, what did I do wrong? And the problem with that is that the question never got answered. So if I did offend a neurotypical person around me, they were going on the assumption that I did know better and that I did it on purpose. I did it because I was trying to seek attention, or because I didn't like them, or I was doing something subtle. And what I really needed people to answer was that question. What did I do wrong? What's wrong? You know, why is it wrong? And what can I do differently? Or what do you expect of me? Because I think neurotypical people, their brains just automatically know what's expected of them just by being in their environment. And a lot of autistic brains don't know that. So I guess it was confusing for them to try to have to explain something that's ingrained to them. I guess it's like explaining how to breathe. But
Mhm.
for me, it was absolutely necessary information. So, and I also titled it, What Did I Do Wrong? Because I think that the neurotypical people also think to themselves, wait a second, how did that interaction go so badly? So there's that disconnect. There's that double empathy problem where the neurotypical person can understand other neurotypical people and the autistic person can understand other autistic people. But when the two neurotypes try to meet in the middle, a lot of miscommunication can happen. So
Mhm.
I basically took the pain and the trauma of being misunderstood, having pretty much my motivations questioned my whole life, and me being the last to know what people thought of me, into a book that basically starts, excuse me, I have it structured where it states the autistic trait, and then it states the commonly misunderstood, or the common things that people think that the autistic person means by that, and then it explains underneath it what's actually happening for the autistic person. And it's just like a really quick guide. I mean, I don't go into comprehensive because I know that in a situation where you don't understand things, or you're already frustrated and you've been miscommunicating for such a long time, that
Mhm.
you need to be able to just do this at a glance. So it's one page each. It's about 60 different misunderstandings, and you can just be like, okay, I don't understand this, go through the index, open it up, and be like, okay, here's what I think might be happening, and here's what's actually happening for the autistic person. So it helps to change your perspective without overwhelming you with information that you might not need to know in that moment.
Yeah, that sounds like a great practical guide, right? I mean, I could see how useful that would be. Can you grab that on Amazon? Where can we grab a copy?
Yeah, you can get it on Amazon for paperback or Kindle.
Perfect. I did want to ask, I want to kind of get into really what it is that you do. How did you learn to bridge the gap in communication differences between the autistic and the neurotypical individuals? How'd you do that?
You know, I don't really think of the mechanics of it, but I think it's something that happens slowly over time. I spent my whole life explaining myself. And it's funny because I always learned, or excuse me, I always heard the same thing over and over. You don't have to explain yourself. Stop explaining yourself. Stop explaining things. Stop this. And of course, I turned it into, this is what I do now. I'm like, no, I'm not going to stop explaining myself. I'm going to do this because I love to do this. And I think people misconstrued it like everything else. Oh, well, she's explaining herself because she needs to talk about herself. It's like, no, I would love it if I could stop explaining. I would love it if people just understood and I could just rest and just relax. And I wrote the book and I started doing this because it may be too late for me to be a relaxed, calm, well-adjusted person, but I don't want the next generation of autistic people to grow up the way I did and to have to be on guard all the time. I think so many autistic people either have complex PTSD or we have some sort of chronic hypervigilance because we never know when the next person's going to yell at us or be offended by something we did. And I just wanted to translate that. So I would do it for myself. I would say, this is why I did this and this is why I did that. And unfortunately, I was in a relationship that was very toxic. And I found myself having to explain myself almost every day. No, that's not what I was thinking. Here's what I was actually thinking. And then it started translating into, okay, I want to talk about my experiences. And I started writing about them. And then I started asking other people. And I guess I remember people coming to me and saying, well, this happens and I don't understand it. And I started to explain it to them. And I realized, hey, I'm actually good at explaining things. And this is a positive. This is not a negative. It was always seen as a negative. And I'm like, you know what? No, let me lean into this. This is who I am. This is what I do. And I basically started calling myself an autistic communication translator because that's what I was doing the whole time. I just didn't know it. And that's how that happened.
I love it because I have the same conversations a lot. I've been doing this podcast for a while now, and it's interesting because communication always comes up, and it
Mhm.
is such an important part, at least on a parenting journey, to have a child that, like Joseph and I, like, we're great, except we could use a translator. So what is, like, if I needed a translation session, what's that like? Tell us about walk us through that.
Well, basically, what I do is if someone books me for a consultation for a translation session, I'd like to have both people in the room. So the neurotypical person and the autistic person. And I like for them to tell me in their own words individually, but while they're side by side, this is what happened. Like, give me an example of like we went somewhere and they said or did this and I felt this way or and usually it's not I wish it was like that. It's usually not like that. It's usually like they said this and they did this and they don't necessarily yell, but they're just frustrated. And it's like I don't understand why can't they just do this? And I guess I hear that a lot. Why can't you just? It's like because the brain doesn't work that way. But then I see the disconnect happening, and then the autistic person will explain, and I'm like, well, okay, hold on. And it's like I start to be like, okay, what I think you're saying is this, and what I think you're saying is that. And sometimes I get these people kind of look at each other almost like they're seeing each other for the first time. And they're like, "Oh, wait a minute, that's what you meant?" And somehow me being a third party, even if that autistic person has said it 100 times, even if the neurotypical person has said it 100 times, just me being the neutral third party going, "Nope, hold on. This is what I think is happening." And I ask, I don't just say this is happening. You know, this is what I'm seeing. And is this true? And sometimes they have these, you can almost see the light bulb go off like over their head. And it's such a beautiful thing. And they sort of look at each other and it's like, oh, wait a minute.
Yeah.
That's what you meant? And you
Yeah.
can feel like the tension just melt away. It's so beautiful.
Mm.
It's a gift. It's a blessing. I love that I'm able to do that. If someone had been able to do that for me,
Yeah.
I just love to be able to be what I would have needed as a child.
Oh, yeah. That is that. So you took what was always a hardship and you've turned it in, realizing, oh my gosh, I actually do have a gift. And it is, from my perspective, it is a true gift. And I love how you have embraced it. I want to get into, aside from your translation sessions, do you have anything that you want to share to help us understand our autistic loved ones, just a better understanding to help us?
Um, well, I mean, it's kind of hard to be succinct about that. I think definitely to if you're struggling to understand your autistic loved one, definitely follow autistic creators. There's tons of autistic creators on social media. I am by far, I'm not the only one. There are a lot of us, a lot of autistic advocates. Read books written by autistic people, not just mine. There's plenty out there, really great books. And communicate with the autistic community, and ask questions, get curious. I think the best advice I could ever give to a neurotypical person who has an autistic loved one is be curious. instead of thinking, oh, thinking, okay, the motivation for this was this, and I'm going to respond this way, which can be hard in the moment. Just get
Right.
curious. Think to yourself, okay, why did this just happen? What
Mhm.
is really happening? And ask questions and investigate before having an emotional reaction. That's probably the best advice I can give.
That's great. Yeah, that's great advice. Never assume that you know
No,
what the other person is saying. Is there anything else you'd like to mention before we go?
I really can't think of anything specific. No,
Okay, perfect. I thoroughly have learned so much from you, and I know our listeners are going to want to know, how can I find you? I know we already you gave it, but tell us one more time, how can we find out more about your work, and where can we find you?
I am the most active on my Instagram page. That's just at the Articulate Autistic. I am also on LinkedIn at the Articulate Autistic, or you can just look me up by my name, Jaime A. Heidel. And you can also find me on thearticulateautistic.com. Although I have to say, I've been neglecting my blog terribly lately. I don't mean to, but I have other things that I've been doing on social media and stuff like that. And you can find my book on Amazon for paperback or Kindle.
Okay. Well, I know you're going to have some people that are going to come find you. Thank you so much for being on our podcast. You have really shared a lot of valuable information with all of us. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
You bet. You'll come back, I have a feeling. So, all right. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our YouTube channel to help us spread knowledge, hope, and inspiration out there to as many people as we can find. And thank you, and I'll see you in the next episode.